Gildan Media presents Robots, written by John Jordan, read by Walter Dixon. Preface. Attempting to write an audiobook about robots represents a leap of faith. The field is already broad and expanding further, and it moves too fast for a multi-year project to be at all current. Why then did I proceed? The field of robotics is, I believe, entering a crucial stage. Technologies are good enough for mass commercialization, use by governments, and even to become invisible in their ubiquity. Robots will soon affect millions of people's lives more directly and profoundly. The technical choices made in robots' design not only embody value judgments and aspirations, they often have ethical implications. Every roboticist I have met is smart, humane, and well-spoken. Even so, I do not want a small population of scientists and engineers working in isolation to make all the decisions that can affect life, death, health, work and livelihood, class status, personal privacy, gender identity, the future of war, the shape of urban landscapes, and many other domains. They need help and other perspectives. This audiobook seeks to widen the circle of individuals who have a say in what robots can and should do, look like, include, and leave out. I hope roboticists listen to this audiobook, but the intended audience is the rest of us. Design choices made now may well be with us for decades, so now is the time to ask and to assert what good robots might look like. Because of the breadth and dynamism of the field, my narrative's emphasis falls less on completeness and the latest developments and more on the enduring issues. What are the persistent capabilities, contests, and trade-offs that will characterize robots and robotics? Why do these issues matter? Many powerful scenarios involve humans and robots working in partnership, rather than robots replacing humans, whether on a battlefield, in a hospital, on an assembly line, or in the rehabilitation, prosthetics, or aging processes. Rather than focusing on either-or debates over what constitutes a robot, we will be better served by seeing compumechanical augmentation of human traits on a continuum. By necessity, this implies both that robots and human beings will be living and working closely, changing the nature of the human condition in important ways, and that, rather than becoming only slaves or potentially overlords, robots will become humanity's partners. These impending changes make improving our theories, norms, and aspirations an urgent matter. This audiobook, this leap of faith, is a small step in that direction. Chapter 1. Introduction. Television and cinema have helped propagate powerful American stories of technology. The Star Wars franchise is in many ways an updated Western, using space as a frontier, though maybe not the final one, and lightsabers as rifles. The impact of such icons, and possibly archetypes as RoboCop, Blade Runner's replicants, the brilliant, mannerly C-3PO, and Walt Disney's WALL-E is wide and deep. Ask about Throwbots, Atlas, Motoman, Kiva, Beam, or other real-life robots that are reinventing warfare, the industrial workplace, and human-robot collaboration, and most people have little sense of what real robots do or look like. But everyone knows the Terminator, complete with Austrian accent. In 2004, Chris Van Allsburg's beloved children's book, The Polar Express, was made into a movie. Oscar-winning talent, including Tom Hanks, was wired up for digital motion capture, but the resulting characters came out, to use critics' words, creepy, eerie, and dead-eyed. The movie was a zombie train. For years, digital animators pushed for more polygons, more shades of color, more pixels, in short, more computing. But instead of delighting audiences with verisimilitude, they entered the uncanny valley, a paradox in which added artificial likeness weirds people out. After 2005, the Japanese female android Repli generated the same reaction with its almost but not quite human-like features. In contrast to Hollywood, Boston Dynamics, between 2013 and 2016 a Google company, builds robots intended for use by the U.S. Armed Services. Non-classified YouTube videos of a robotic cheetah, humanoid, and pack animal have received tens of millions of views, giving many people their first look at state-of-the-art robotic science. Rather than the moderately large viewership, most striking to me was my students' reaction when a human shoved and kicked the big dog to show its stability. They gasped, as if someone had struck a pet on camera. Robots are becoming more numerous, more capable, and more diverse. Over the long run, their economic, civic, and destructive impact will likely be on par with that of the automobile. In such a massive transition, people will care what happens and call for rules, norms, and paths of recourse. Citizens have a vested interest in work, wages, and workplace safety, in aging with dignity, in major changes in global warfare, in privacy, and in other things that robotics has the potential to change. Many factors, however, combine to make it hard to advance the discussions about what we want from today's and tomorrow's robots. Barriers to informed dialogue. When an innovation emerges, the history of its naming shows how it goes from foreign entity to novelty to invisible ubiquity. A little more than 100 years ago, automobiles were called horseless carriages, defined by what they were not rather than what they were. More recently, the U.S. military referred to drones as UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, continuing the trend of definition by negation. The word robot originated in the 1920s and was at first a type of slave. Robots are often characterized by their capabilities in performing dull, dirty, or dangerous tasks, sparing humans the need to perform them. The science and engineering of the field continue to evolve rapidly. Look no further than Google's self-driving car or the humanoid robots it acquired in the Shaft and Boston Dynamics deals. Given such rapid change, computer scientists cannot come to anything resembling consensus on what constitutes a robot. Some argue that a given device qualifies if it can 1. Sense its surroundings, 2. Perform logical reasoning with various inputs, and 3. Act upon the physical environment. Others insist a robot must move in physical space, disqualifying the Nest thermostat, while still others say that true robots are autonomous, excluding factory assembly tools. Reason number 1 why robots are hard to talk about? The definitions are unsettled, even among those most expert in the field. Bernard Roth, a longtime professor of mechanical engineering who was associated with the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, SAIL, or SAIL, from its inception, offers a more nuanced definition that draws on his long history in the field. Roth begins by doubting that a definition of what is or is not a robot will ever be universally agreed upon. Instead, he argues for a much more relative and conditional approach. My view is that the notion of a robot has to do with which activities are, at a given time, associated with people and which are associated with machines. When relative capabilities evolve, so do conceptions. If a machine suddenly becomes able to do what we normally associate with people, the machine can be upgraded in classification and classified as a robot. After a while, people get used to the activity being done by machines, and the devices get downgraded from robot to machine. Reason number 2 why robots are hard to talk about? Definitions evolve unevenly and jerkily over time as social context and technical capabilities change. Expectations for robotics are different from those for every other new technology because the vocabulary of robotics is so deeply a legacy of science fiction, both in literature and movies and on television. No technology has ever been so widely described and explored before its commercial introduction. The Internet, cell phones, refrigeration and air conditioning, elevators, atomic energy, and countless other innovations that remade lives and landscapes saw the daylight of commercialization relatively quietly. Only later, if at all, did fiction invent vast numbers of fantasies, reaching audiences in the hundreds of millions with the technologies at the center. In sharp contrast, fiction preceded and conditioned the science and engineering of robotics in an unprecedented fashion. Reason number 3 why robots are hard to talk about? Science fiction set the boundaries of the conceptual playing field before the engineers did. This paradox relates in part to a historical accident, the means by which mass-market sci-fi was disseminated between 1940 and 2000. Paperback and comic books, cinema, television, all came of age in that same period. Thus, the technologies of mass media helped create public conceptions of and expectations for a whole body of compumechanical innovation that had not happened yet. Complex, pervasive attitudes and expectations predated the invention of viable products. Given that modern Western robotics has been so strongly influenced by science fiction, why might that matter? A whole system of meanings and expectations has been created by fantasy rather than fact. Most important, science fiction has set expectations for real robots unrealistically high. Non-technical journalists, fiction writers, and even the Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom ask if a robot might volitionally turn against its maker, even when that would be technically impossible. The point here is that other cultural cargo was smuggled in with the stories and movies. Assumptions about robots relative to work, warfare, and human ability or disability will need to be consciously revisited at the same time that we examine ethics, autonomy, and the supposed capacity for evil. A further naming issue must be raised here. Although it has neither the fictional nor especially the cinematic legacy of the robots, the related notion of artificial intelligence creates instant confusion and distrust among many non-roboticists. Elon Musk, the CEO of SpaceX and Tesla Motors, said in a 2014 MIT symposium that AI might be humanity's biggest existential threat. I think we should be very careful about artificial intelligence. If I were to guess what our biggest existential threat is, it's probably that. So we need to be very careful with the artificial intelligence. Increasingly, scientists think there should be some regulatory oversight, maybe at the national and international level, just to make sure that we don't do something very foolish. With artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demon. In all those stories where there's the guy with the pentagram and the holy water, and it's like, yeah, he's sure he can control the demon. Didn't work out. Note Musk's recourse to myth and fiction as he attempts to explain his perspective on a vast scientific landscape. Moving away from wizards and demons, recall that the biggest successes in the field of artificial intelligence have come in controlled, limited domains. Chess, Go, and the Jeopardy game show most visibly, but also type-ahead search fields and automated mobile ad placement. It is critically important to distinguish between artificial general intelligence and eventually human-like cognition and the domain-specific algorithms used to do tasks such as credit scoring, fraud detection, or Google Map route planning, each of which is essentially worthless outside its tuned specialty. That said, deep learning is getting a lot better very fast. But, as I will argue, maybe the human brain isn't the proper benchmark for success. Yet the fear of artificial life forms surpassing humans in capability is widespread. This fear persists, even though extremely basic tasks, such as getting the printer to connect, remain challenging. Whether robotic technologies are called AI, robots, or super-developed intelligent personal assistants, such as Apple's Siri or Spike Jonze's Samantha in the film Her, matters only slightly. The fear and uncertainty generated by fictional representations far exceed human reactions to real robots, which are often reported to be underwhelming. Reason 4 why robots are hard to talk about? Robotics bleeds into other technologies that are even more poorly understood and ominously portrayed in many cultures. Path dependence. Every new technology that begins in a laboratory and enters wide use passes through a series of stages. Early on, first basic, then applied science can be prohibitively difficult. Engineering at this stage of development is hard, and the primary question at hand is, how can we make this work? Slightly later, before entrepreneurs and others solve the business model question, how might this technology make money? There comes a time when design decisions are made that will shape much of the technology's future impact. Alternating versus direct electricity, railroad gauges, and typewriter keyboard layouts are all examples of an economic notion called path dependence. Today's choices are constrained by technical decisions made in the past. In the fields of artificial intelligence, robotics, sensors, and information collection and processing, among others, we are at a point where people beyond the engineers and scientists should be involved in the discussion. How do we make it work is still a live issue, but we also have a choice among multiple paths forward. In short, it's time to start asking more people what they desire and what they resist from these technologies. Robotics has many potential implications for economic livelihoods and wealth accumulation, identity and relationships, citizenship and warfare, privacy and individual agency. Design choices involve far more than only engineering constraints. Politics, economics, luck, and other forces are also at work, but, thus far, are being addressed only peripherally. To make this notion less abstract, consider two examples. Jaron Lanier tells a story in his book, You Are Not a Gadget, that applies beautifully. When the musical instrument digital interface, MIDI or MIDI, first connected synthesizers to computers, a design decision was made based on the state of computer science to make keyboard triggers essentially binary. Either the key was pressed, in the digital domain, or it was not. Real music, like the blues, however, allows musicians to bend or otherwise shape notes, such as on a guitar or harmonica. MIDI music cannot sound this way because of the path dependence related to the initial specification. As a result, we have had 30 years of what Lanier calls beepy-sounding electronic music, and it didn't have to be that way. More recently, Google tried to expand and integrate its social services such as YouTube, Gmail, and Grand Central, since 2009 Google Voice, into a network called Google+, launched in 2011. For a number of reasons, the service insisted that people sign up with their real-world names and gender identity. Real name identification had the upside of reducing flame wars in some online forums, and made life easier for Google to track user behavior across its properties for advertising purposes. But it posed a privacy nightmare for some people. At least one transgender person's sexual identity was revealed in a text message without consent because of Google's integration of Google Plus information into Android address books. In 2014, Google co-founder Sergey Brin, who was intimately involved in Google Plus design decisions, admitted, "I'm probably the worst person to speak about social. I'm just not a very social person." As with countless design choices, that decision had far-reaching consequences. In addition to personal inconvenience and worse, Brin's rigid insistence on real name integration across Google's many websites alienated many users and probably contributed to Google Plus's weak public reception. Later, in 2014, Google abandoned the policy. Why robotics matters. Some concrete considerations. How does robotics differ from what we came to know of digital computing from 1950 until 2005 or so? Here are just a few examples of big, complex issues we need to confront, and quickly. 1. With cameras and sensors everywhere, on telephone poles, on people's faces, in people's pockets, in the ground, on water mains or monitoring seismic activity, and in the sky, drone photography has given rise to a rapidly evolving body of legal judgment and contestation. The boundaries of privacy, security, and risk are all being reset. What are the rights of the observed and the responsibilities of the observer? A powerfully dystopian vision of pervasive monitoring, peer pressure and social networks, and winner-take-all markets can be found in Dave Eggers' novel, The Circle. 2. When robots enter combat, how and when will they be hacked? Who will program a self-driving suicide bomb? The Islamic State was reported to be doing so in early 2016. Are drone pilots or robot software writers subject to the Geneva Convention? When robots administer torture, who is responsible? This technology, so aggressively developed by the military, will open multiple debates in the realm of warfare and conflict. 3. Computer science, information theory, statistics, and physics in terms of magnetic media, are all being stress-tested by the huge volumes of data generated by our increasingly instrumented planet. Sensors are intrinsic to robots. The two domains are often difficult to distinguish. A General Electric jet engine is reported to take off, on average, every 2 seconds worldwide. Each engine generates a terabyte of data per flight. Even when a 10-to-1 compression takes this figure down to 100 gigabytes per flight, that's about 1 million DVDs worth of raw data every day. Because it cannot all be kept for any length of time, sampling, further compressing, logging, and other data actions must be perfected. Dealing with information problems at this scale, in nearly every domain, raises grand challenge-scale hurdles in business, academe, medicine, and even sports. 4. The half-life of technical knowledge appears to diminish even faster. Machine learning, machine vision in robots, and other fields are evolving rapidly, complicating employment patterns and career evolution. Robots will obviously displace manual laborers, but engineers, programmers, and scientists will also be hard-pressed to maintain current skills. In addition, we are increasingly dealing with platforms, such as Microsoft Windows, Apple iOS, and Google Maps, rather than products. Platforms are far more powerful. As Chunka Moy and Paul Carroll point out, every Google self-driving car learns from the experiences of every other Google car. Accordingly, how will we learn to think about a world in which Google could put cars, robots, thermostats, watches, and phones on a common Android software base? Platform economics, involving as they do such key concepts as lock-in and license exclusivity, have powerful and far-reaching social effects. 5. What are the rules of engagement with computing that moves about in the wild? A woman wearing a Google Glass headset was assaulted in a bar after she violated an implied social contract. Self-driving cars don't yet have clear liability laws. 3D printing of guns and of patented or copyrighted material has yet to be sorted out. Nobody knows what happens when people can invoke facial recognition of a stranger on the sidewalk. Google could see consumer or EU blowback if it uses Nest sensor data to drive ad targeting. As a reminder of how much these rules matter, when the telephone was first introduced, it was socially impolite to greet someone to whom you had not been introduced. As a result, many languages have 2 words of greeting, one for the phone, the French allô, and one in person, bonjour. Alexander Graham Bell had his own preferred solution in English, using ahoy as the telephonic greeting. 130 years later, we have much to negotiate in the next wave of physical computing, including the norms that apply to social life. 6. How will these technologies augment and amplify human capability? Whether through exoskeletons, care robots, telepresence, or prostheses, the human condition will change in shape, reach, and scope in the next 100 years. At the same time, how will humans enable the new computing models? An ATM, or self-driving car, needs to be instructed, as does the Da Vinci surgical system, which, though robotic, does not really qualify as a robot. The potential for collaborations between human and compumechanical systems is mind-boggling. How many more Stephen Hawkings, Adrian Hazlitt Davises, or Robin Millers will we see? But first, a variety of technical and non-technical challenges must be identified, named, and negotiated, not just solved. And how will access to these augmentations be allocated? 7. Compared to keyboards, screens, and mice, robotics helps introduce a myriad of new ways for humans and machines to interact. Nods, winks, finger swipes, spoken commands, and even brain waves can generate actions. Given human variation, cultural differences, vast differences in languages, and physical constraints like power consumption or water resistance, how will humans learn to drive all these new tools? One fascinating set of decisions relates to color. Many mobile robots currently share a clinical white color, including Sony Aibo, Honda Asimo, Bestick, Jibo, Beam, and Atlas II. Recall that for years, desktop PCs were uniformly beige. Then black or gray became common until Apple redefined the color spectrum with shades of turquoise and tangerine. Given that computers close to humans convey layers of meaning, it will be worth watching how the red Baxter robot is received, and if black or brown variations of autonomous robots might be developed, potentially for less Caucasian markets. 8. The infrastructure enabled and required by robotics and related fields, such as the Internet of Things or IoT, looks very different from that of an industrial economy. Systems get bigger as needs increase and technologies of management and control get better. In part, these changes reflect new risks. Robotic technologies also require different kinds of workplaces. No more need for warehouses to be air-conditioned for human comfort, but assembly line bots need safety cages. Transit systems will change as robots on the move, whether on a roadway, in airspace, or in a hospital corridor, require different signals and safety precautions than human drivers do. Together, these 8 sets of questions involve law, belief, economics, education, public commons, public safety, and human identity, along with technical fields of power management, magnetic storage, material science, algorithmic calculation, and more. Given the breadth and magnitude of its impacts, robotics is simply too important, and now too close at hand, to be left only to technical specialists. Summary. The laws, stories, economic forces, and blind spots accompanying robots and robotics are neither inevitable nor obvious. They take work to craft, untangle, and assess. The next wave of computing will introduce profound changes which will eventually rival those brought about by the automobile, household electricity, or running water. As an example, consider the profound impact of drone warfare in the absence of public or even congressional debate over its ethical, political, and strategic implications. Given that the technologies for self-driving cars, embedded or face-mounted computers and sensors, and autonomous robots are all coming to market in a matter of months rather than decades, the circle of people involved in overseeing them needs to be widened. Time and again, engineers and scientists have answered the question, how can we make this work? Now it's time for more of us to ask, what realistic choices can be made in each of these domains, and to help make those choices. This process is anything but straightforward. People often don't know what they want when presented with known alternatives, as the study of choice architectures reveals. As ways of assessing new products, focus groups and other techniques for market research are fatally flawed. Prior to the launch of the iPhone, smartphone sales were largely confined to BlackBerry and Nokia devices, none of which had glass interfaces. 5 years later, both companies had become essentially irrelevant as Apple and Google's Android mobile operating systems dominated the market, even though both Research in Motion and Nokia spent heavily on research and development. So far, robot markets have yet to declare their preferences. That said, for private drones, face-mounted computers, and other technologies, the time has come to consider rules of the road, outright prohibitions, and warning signs to be watched in the early phases of adoption. The field of robot ethics addresses some of these issues. One line of thinking dates back to Isaac Asimov, and considerable effort is still spent in wrestling with problems of human versus compumechanical agency, particularly with regard to human harm. People also have a deep-rooted habit of attributing cognizance and motive, the machine is thinking, where neither is present. Closer to our own time, the moral dimension of military robots programmed to shoot first in the interest of self-preservation has drawn worldwide attention, as from the NGO group Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. Elsewhere, even Steven Pinker, a leading scientist of the brain, is clear in his stance on human moral responsibility. Why give a robot an order to obey orders? Why aren't the original orders enough? Why command a robot not to do harm? Wouldn't it be easier never to command it to do harm in the first place? In addition, the emerging capabilities of artificial intelligence, a field with both contested self-definitions and broad application to robotics, make boundaries between humans and machines even fuzzier. Some of the design decisions that will be made in the coming years have high stakes, with consequences that involve the very essence of human agency, identity, and belief. Robotics introduces a new layer of complexity into the fields of artificial intelligence, big data, and ultimately, human meaning. Not only does the long history of human efforts to create artificial life see a new chapter, but also, people can now create artificial life in vast networks that will behave differently than a single entity. Frankenstein's creature can be understood as a forerunner of the Boston Dynamics Atlas robot, but there isn't as visible a precedent for self-tuning sensor nets or swarms of self-organizing drones. The change is happening at a faster rate of technological innovation than humans are accustomed to, raising further complications. This transition is in the early stages, and human intellect is often held up as the ideal to which machine designers should aspire. Ray Kurzweil's entire singularity notion is premised on the idea that we have the ability to understand our own intelligence, to access our own source code, if you will, and then revise and expand it. At the same time, machines that surpass humans in capability represent a new chapter in the technics out of control meme that the historian of technology Langdon Winner has so ably catalogued. Although caution in the early adoption of any new technology is prudent, as examples from nuclear power clearly show, our fear of robotic technology is largely misplaced. According to Rodney Brooks, the CEO of Rethink Robotics and a longtime MIT researcher in the field, achieving AI is really difficult. For silicon circuitry to develop conscious malevolence is likely at least a century off. As Brooks noted in November 2014, if we are spectacularly lucky, we'll have AI over the next 30 years with the intentionality of a lizard, and robots using that AI will be useful tools, and they probably won't really be aware of us in any serious way. Worrying about AI that will be intentionally evil to us is pure fear-mongering and an immense waste of time. At some levels, humanity is at a stage somewhere between Da Vinci and the Wright brothers in the development of powered flight. Airplanes do not fly by flapping wings, nor do birds carry 500 people 9,500 miles. Projects to reverse engineer the human brain, running as it does more on chemistry than on electrons, seem to be limited in their applicability. Instead of Hollywood archetypes and linguistic illusions, we need the lab work for which Orville and Wilbur Wright are less appreciated. They invented not just the airplane, but significant advances in the science of aeronautics, as well as the method for flying the airplane. The human metaphors embedded in robotics and artificial intelligence are shaping progress in this field, likely holding us back as much as they inspire. 22nd century AI will probably no more mimic the human brain than the airplane mimics a bird, or a wheel mimics a leg. Abstracting the problem beyond biomimicry represents an initial step in this process. Who will build the equivalent of the wind tunnel for cognition? Regardless of the state of computing, science fiction, or filmmaking, we are about to colonize new territory on the technological frontier. And though it is appropriate to honor the pioneers, it is equally appropriate for the settlers to have a voice in the laws, customs, economics, and social conventions that we will observe. Because we live in ever closer proximity to computing that inhabits and transforms our physical world, it is time to question the mental models we use to describe robotics. Chapter 2. The Prehistory of an Idea. Humans have attempted to recreate life for millennia, and many robots of the early 21st century continue these traditions. The context for today's efforts is important to acknowledge, especially given both the problematic and enduring character of some of these discussions. The impact of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is difficult to overstate. Take only one example. Words. Before we look at history, a bit about terminology. For such a familiar concept, it turns out that robots are extremely difficult to define. According to the American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language, 3rd edition, a robot is a mechanical device that sometimes resembles a human being and is capable of performing a variety of often complex human tasks on command or by being programmed in advance. Emphasis mine. This biomimicry raises one set of issues, especially in regard to autonomous robots. The Oxford English Dictionary definition introduces a second, literary area of complexity. Chiefly science fiction, an intelligent artificial being typically made of metal and resembling in some way a human or other animal. Roboticists themselves struggle to pin down the definition of their field. George Becky, an expert in autonomous robots, defined a robot by its characteristics: sensing, artificial cognition, and physical action. Never ask a roboticist what a robot is, Hila Reza Norbaksh of Carnegie Mellon, and another expert on autonomous robots, tells us. The answer changes too quickly. By the time researchers finish their most recent debate on what is and isn't a robot, the frontier moves on as whole new interaction technologies are born. Rodney Brooks, when he was at MIT, called robots artificial creatures. According to a college textbook chosen at random, the Robot Institute of America defines a robot as a reprogrammable, multifunctional manipulator designed to move materials, parts, tools, or specialized devices through variable programmed motions for the performance of a variety of tasks. This definition does not exclude human beings. Cynthia Breazeal at MIT gained fame for her work on Kismet, a special variety of humanoid robot that interacted with people using gestures, facial expressions, and sounds. What is a sociable robot? She asks in her book on the topic. It is a difficult concept to define. After pointing to science fiction for some examples, she asserts, in short, a sociable robot is socially intelligent in a human-like way, and interacting with it is like interacting with another person. At the pinnacle of achievement, they could befriend us, as we could them. Once again, a leading roboticist resorts to describing robots by what they do, rather than what they are. Two relatively recent definitions illustrate the lack of consensus, a real problem when it comes to fostering intelligent debate over a topic with far-reaching implications for personal and public life. Maya J. Matarik of the University of Southern California published The Robotics Primer in 2007 as a K-12 guide to this important field. Almost immediately in the opening chapter, she states that a robot is an autonomous system which exists in the physical world, can sense its environment, and can act on it to achieve some goals. She goes on to underline her conviction. True robots may be able to take input and advice from humans, but are not completely controlled by them. Contrast this strict definition, which excludes many familiar machines such as surgical robots, drone aircraft, and industrial robots, with the definition used on a 60 Minutes broadcast in 2013 that focused on technological unemployment. Narrator Steve Croft began the segment by saying that everyone has a different idea of what a robot is and what they look like, but the broad universal definition is a machine that can perform the job of a human. They can be mobile or stationary, hardware or software, and they are marching out of the realm of science fiction and into the mainstream. Apart from the nearly complete lack of overlap with roboticists' definitions, this characterization is notable for its implied theme of machines out of control, rising up against their human masters. From the core of computer science comes a similarly inclusive reading. Vinton Cerf, widely known for his work on the Transmission Control Protocol, TCP, and Internet Protocol, IP, which underlie all Internet traffic, was elected president of the Association of Computing Machinery in 2012. In an editorial in January 2013, Cerf posited that the notion of robot could usefully be expanded to include programs that perform functions, ingest input and produce output that has a perceptible effect. After mentioning high-frequency stock trading as an example, he argued that one might conclude that we should treat as robots any programs that can have real-world, if not physical, effect. In his conclusion, Cerf reveals a broader concern for the implications of contemporary computing and communications, including robotics, strictly defined. I believe it would be a contribution to our society to encourage deeper thinking about what we in the computing world produce, the tools we use to produce them, the resilience and reliability that these products exhibit, and the risks that they may introduce. This thinking helps move the discussion of robotics away from anthropomorphism and toward instrumentality. For Cerf, a robot is largely a function of software rather than the box it inhabits. but that software increasingly does have implications for the world of atoms, whether in the form of denial-of-service attacks, cyber warfare on physical infrastructure, such as Stuxnet, a computer virus that disabled centrifuges enriching atomic weapons material in Iran, or inside a mobile and potentially autonomous robot. For our purposes, the most useful definition comes from George Becky, who wrote in 2005 that a robot is a machine that senses, thinks, and acts. Thus, a robot must have sensors, processing ability that emulate some aspects of cognition, and actuators. Robotics is the collected sciences that combine to study, design, and build these devices. Computer science is in the forefront, drawing also on materials science, psychology, statistics, mathematics, and various disciplines in physics and engineering. Artificial intelligence concerns itself with the recreation of human cognition in silicon semiconductors, either generally or in a delimited domain to be constrained and optimized. Historical automata. For all of this definitional uncertainty, billions of people around the world know a robot when they see one, based on literary and Hollywood portrayals, so it is important to note the precise origins of the term. People have been creating automated models of living systems for millennia. Cuckoo clocks, toys, and elaborate automaton hoaxes date back hundreds of years. One of these dates from 1770 and involved a chess-playing automaton with a chess master hiding inside that defeated both Benjamin Franklin and Napoleon. It provided the name for Amazon's Mechanical Turk, a service in which computers ask people for help in doing tasks computers aren't good at, such as image recognition. A more colorful invention came from France, a country that continues to help define the robotics horizon. A child of the Enlightenment, Jacques de Vaucanson, attempted to apply the notions of the clockwork universe to biological life. In 1735, at the age of 26, he invented some machines that could excite public curiosity, specifically a mechanical duck. Vaucanson's duck combined a realistic exterior with some unsurprising mechanical characteristics. It could sit, stand, waddle, quack, drink water, and eat pellets of corn. A secondary trick made Vaucanson a celebrity and gained him election to the prestigious Académie des Sciences, alongside René Descartes, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and Blaise Pascal. The mechanical duck also defecated. People lined up to see the wonder, paying admissions fees equal to a week's wages for some. Vaucanson then became director of France's silk mills, where in 1745 he invented a punch card system for controlling weaving patterns, a foundation invention for the jacquard loom, developed in 1801, that proved to influence the early history of computing, when punched cards were once again used to control a sequence of operations. As for the duck, 40 years later it was found, like the chess machine, to be a hoax. The bird did no digesting, but rather captured the inputs in one reservoir and dispensed the output from a second one. As the noted policy analyst P.W. Singer points out, Vaucanson's duck provides a vivid illustration of humanity's long-running efforts to create artificial life. In Jewish folklore, the concept of a golem, which is an anthropomorphic figure made from inanimate material, dates back to biblical times. For centuries, the word android was used to describe automatons resembling a human being, to quote the Oxford English Dictionary. The word dates from 1728, less than a decade before the infamous duck. Mary Shelley published Frankenstein, often cited as the first science fiction novel in 1818, and described the dire consequences of trying to create life in the laboratory. In 1822, Charles Babbage built his difference engine, a mechanical calculator containing more than 25,000 parts. So people have been trying to create simulations of biological life for a long time. Where did robots enter the picture? Automata, science fiction. By the time he published his play, R.U.R., Rossum's Universal Robots, in 1920, Karel Čapek was a well-known Czech intellectual. Like other writers, he was appalled by the carnage wrought by the mechanical and chemical weapons that marked the Great War as a departure from previous combat. The play introduced the robot, an artificial human made from biological material, into the English language as a protest against the dehumanization caused by the modern age. Conformity, lack of aspiration, and a cheerful attitude toward dull work were all critiqued within the concept. The word derives from the Czech word robota, or forced labor, as done by serfs. Its Slavic linguistic root rob means slave. Thus, the original word for robots more accurately defines androids in that they were neither metallic nor mechanical. Several were mistaken for human beings in the play. The play was widely performed and the text translated into many languages. Probably because the robot was an idea whose time had come, for science fiction at any rate, popular depictions proliferated in the following decades. Thus, the definitional dilemma in which we find ourselves dates back about 100 years, to a time when a literary artist used a slavery metaphor to protest the devaluation of human life in a mechanical era. Through the 1920s, robot images centered on the hubris of humans creating life, connecting mechanical invention to Frankenstein and earlier legends of overreaching humanity. By 1942, however, the next wave of definition was taking the notion of a robot in a much more positive direction. Either directly through his writing or indirectly through his wide influence, Isaac Asimov, born Isaac Yudovich Asimov in Russia in 1920, is single-handedly responsible for most North American concepts of what a robot can be. Early in his astonishingly prolific career as a writer, with more than 500 books to his credit, Asimov helped found the modern genre of science fiction. In later years, he published literary criticism, nonfiction science writing, mysteries, and novels. After earning the first of his 3 degrees in chemistry from Columbia in 1939, Asimov teamed up with John W. Campbell, who edited Astounding Science Fiction magazine, to generate the 3 Laws of Robotics, which both served as the governing principles for his robotic science fiction and guided generations of roboticists whose field at the time lacked formal definition, ethical codes of conduct, and other marks of professional maturity. In the early years of this complex work, science fiction was both powerfully inspirational and the only widely available resource, and Asimov stood at the forefront. As he later wrote in a nonfiction introduction to the state of robotics in the 1980s, Asimov was tiring of robots that were either unrealistically wicked or unrealistically noble, and began to write science fiction tales in which robots were viewed merely as machines, built, as all machines are, with an attempt at adequate safeguards. 9 of the stories written in the 1940s in response to this impulse were collected in the book I, Robot. In one of them, Asimov coins the term robotics, and so named an entire discipline of modern science and engineering. Asimov's 3 Laws of Robotics worked well to define a fictional environment, but have been less useful in actual practice, no matter how often people have tried to encode them in hardware nearly 75 years after they were written as the premise of a fantasy. The laws are as follows. 1. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. 2. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second law. Later, when his stories included robots interacting with entire civilizations and not only individuals, Asimov added a 4th law, called the Zero Law, in that it came first in logical priority. It took precedence over his previous laws. 0. A robot may not harm humanity, or, by inaction, allow humanity to come to harm. Asimov's laws continue to exercise substantial influence in the robotic community, although even a cursory reading suggests they are difficult or impossible to engineer into silicon circuitry. P.W. Singer addresses Asimov's laws in the context of drone aircraft and other military technologies that, by definition, ignore Law Number 1. Singer states that the absence of technology-specific ethical codes is troubling in the domain of combat. Can a robot be used as an instrument of torture, for instance? But unsurprising, given how most industries regulate drugs, guns, automobiles, and other ethically complex technologies, as lightly as possible. Rodney Brooks, For years, the director of the MIT Robotics Initiative says quite simply, "We do not know how to build robots that are perceptive enough and smart enough to obey these three laws," adding that it's possible Asimov didn't realize just what a perceptual load these laws put on a robot. As recently as 2009, Professors Robin Murphy of Texas A&M and David D. Woods of Ohio State put forth what they called the 3 Laws of Responsible Robotics. The article was intended as a way to ask necessary questions about responsibility, intention, and unintended consequences, not in fictional stories, but real-world factories, nursing homes, and labs. Their laws follow. Note the primacy of human responsibility rather than compumechanical wisdom. 1. A human may not deploy a robot without the human-robot work system meeting the highest legal and professional standards of safety and ethics. 2. A robot must respond to humans as appropriate for their roles. 3. A robot must be endowed with sufficient situated autonomy to protect its own existence as long as such protection provides smooth transfer of control which does not conflict with the first and second laws. In short, one problem with the pervasiveness of science fiction is its emphasis on the robot rather than the human as the relevant moral actor. Gray area. After more than a half-century of field trials of computer-enabled robots, we still lack a complete or nuanced understanding of what a robot is or is not. In the case of an automated guided vehicle, AGV, following a strip on the floor of a warehouse, there is sensing and locomotion, but it would appear that cognition can be absent or minimal. Notably, the first AGVs were not called robots, and even today it is unclear how such devices are categorized. By contrast, the industrial robot, typically anchored in place, doing a repetitive task by electronic memory and operating inside a cage for human safety, can trace some of its U.S. origins directly to Asimov. Joseph Engelberger was explicitly motivated to build something much more than a new kind of machine tool. Over and over, the advice was, don't call it a robot, call it a programmable manipulator, call it a production terminal or a universal transfer device. The word is robot, and it should be robot. I was building a robot, damn it, and I wasn't going to have any fun in Asimov's terms unless it was a robot, so I stuck to my guns. The sense, think, act paradigm proves to be problematic for industrial robots. Some observers contend that a robot needs to be able to move. Otherwise, the Watson computer might qualify. Another more recent example comes from Silicon Valley. The Nest is a learning thermostat. Powered by sensors and connected by Wi-Fi, it tracks a household's behaviors and modifies the temperature automatically. The team behind the Nest has more than its fair share of advanced degrees in computer science and robotics, and a clear record of genuine consumer product innovation. Many worked on the Apple iPod or Google search engine. The Nest senses movements, temperature, humidity, and light. It reasons. If there's no activity, nobody is home to need air conditioning. It acts. Given the right sensor input, it autonomously shuts the furnace down. Fulfilling as it does the 3 conditions, is the Nest therefore a robot? The fact that Google bought the startup at about the same time it made other robot investments suggests to some people that it is. Intuitive Surgical makes the Da Vinci surgical system. Using sensitive joysticks, a surgeon makes the Da Vinci move probes and surgical tools inside a patient's body. The system certainly has sensors, and it acts on human patients. But without autonomous cognition, can the Da Vinci really be called a robot? Asimov did not define what a robot was, but posited a hypothetical moral system to which idealized robots should adhere. Dictionaries are of no help. Hollywood portrayals will be analyzed further, but for now, suffice it to say that neither the 1960s cartoon character Rosie Jetson, nor Stanley Kubrick's HAL, nor George Lucas's R2-D2 defines what a robot is, or is not. Neither does any one of the hundreds of industrial robots at work in a typical auto factory. Yet, almost all of us know a robot when we see one.